Hiya, and welcome to Mandatory Redistribution Party. Imagine a life in which not only your needs, but your desires are met. You don't just get food and shelter, but a delicious bioengineered steak that's both vegan and good for you. A house made out of chrome, but really comfy chrome. You gaze upon your reflection in your chrome sofa. You look great. You wink at yourself. Imagine the only work you do being stuff like playing Guitar Hero and finally writing that epic poem about cheese. Whatever you might call it, post-capitalism, fully automated luxury communism, anarcho-beef chrome future, this idea is an appealing one that's been rattling around in leftist brains for a while. In this episode, I talked to Mareile Pfannebecker and J. Smith about some of the ideas in their upcoming book, Work, Want, Work, Labour and Desire at the End of Capitalism. In this really interesting book, they explore not only how we think about work now, but how the logic of work worms its way even into imagined non-capitalist societies. One of many interesting aspects of their thought is how they pick up on the problem of desire. Do you actually want a bioengineered steak that's both vegan and good for you, and a house made of chrome that makes you look super bangable? Or has capitalism or something else created those desires in you? How can you know? Does it even matter? We get into this, but we start with where the idea for the book came from and its relationship to these post-work ideas that became so prevalent in about 2015.
Around that time, there was a sort of new appearance of the fantasy of the post-work utopia, the idea of automation taking all of our work tasks away from us, leading us into a new sort of freedom. And you were seeing that with books like Inventing the Future by Nick Cernick and Alex Williams, Paul Mason, who I know you've had on the show, him on post-capitalism, and early, why are you chuckling about
just
Paul Mason?
The difference between book Paul Mason and like online, online Paul Mason, who has categorically melted.
Well, you're starting to sound like a Stalinist, Jeff.
Yeah.
Which I'm very concerned.
Well, Stalinist by Paul Mason's criteria, which is sort of everyone in it. But yeah, post-capitalism definitely had that vibe,
So we're getting that. And then, Bastani on fully automated luxury communism. So there was this sort of sudden rise in this very optimistic utopian discourse. And we were kind of struck by the way in which that was coming about in the context of austerity, the recession, and 2015, the Tories won the election. Political conditions that seemed totally antithetical to this kind of luxury communist idea. And yet here it was. And as we started kind of pulling on that thread and looking into the history of the idea, we realised that going back into the 19th century, it's often been moments when working life is at its most appalling that this most radical idea has come along. We kind of had a desire to look at the way in which the idea of a post-work future was being deployed in activism and politics today. Very quickly, a lot of those people we've named would get absorbed as Corbyn outriders. That's one of the things that got in the way of us writing this slightly more reflective, philosophical, albeit political book earlier. So really it's a book about the way in which the kind of concept of work is very difficult to get rid of. And in a time when we're told by the most radical activists that we could have an automated future without work, a time when we're told by sociologists and management studies people that our old idea of the kind of coherent job and career is now over and we're going to have a different relationship to work. Nonetheless, in all kinds of spheres of life, from formal work to our laziest pleasure, nonetheless this persistent logic of work reappears.
Happy with that?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Yes, that's a good start.
Nailed it. I thought an interesting place to begin would be the concept of alienation. So could you explain what you understand by that, possibly with reference to bakers?
Sure.
I guess alienation is the Marxist concept with the way in which your labour is never your own. With the bakers, actually, I'll let you talk about the bakers briefly, and then we'll see.
We refer to the tragedy of not being a baker. This sociologist, Richard Sennett, one of his celebrated case studies is that in the 70s he observed this group of American bakers, this kind of way in which their very hard work nonetheless was connected to their identity as part of an immigrant community. In the 1990s, Sennett went back and visited the same bakeries and found that it was no longer these guys all getting up really early in the morning as part of this same team every day. It was all shift work. It was no longer homogenous in terms of ethnic background, no longer homogeneously male either. But more significantly, the kind of art and knowledge that was required of that apparently simple kind of task of baking had been removed from what they were doing, that now it was automated ovens and very kind of simple techniques. This isn't to idealise the old work of being a baker. Nonetheless, it's crucial to sort of see, as it were, the identity of that being the job seemed to have gone by the 1990s. These people didn't consider themselves bakers as such, and actually from their point of view the work that they were doing could have been found in any number of other tasks. We go from that to the way in which in our own moment it's not only sort of traditional working class jobs that are undertaking this loss of coherent task or identity. Actually, we are living through a time where traditional bourgeois professions are taking on exactly the same pattern, so that whoever you talk to, whether they are ostensibly a baker, whether they work for Amazon, or whether they, on paper they're a solicitor or a university lecturer, everybody seems to speak in the same language. They say, yeah, this is my job, but I don't really get to do it. It's all admin now, or it's all a kind of customer services work now. What used to be a secondary part of all these jobs has become the dominant one, and I guess that would fit in with this kind of long story of alienation. I guess the thing about Marxist alienation is you can always be a bit more alienated.
And I guess the other problem with that is that at least if you've got a certain set of expertise, craft skills that you need in order to do the job, then you have some sort of leverage towards the boss. Hence, the power of the unions traditionally, and the emergence of so many jobs now, which, apart from the weakening of existing unions, which of course is happening as well, it's just increasingly difficult to unionize, at least in the form that they take right now, because they are so parceled up into small tasks that ultimately anybody could do, i.e. a machine could do. So hence that problem of political leverage that is bound up with what might in the first instance look like nostalgia for past where bakers were wholesomely connected to their tasks. So in some ways it's not that so much that's the point, but the extent to which alienation here isn't just a feeling, but it is a very cold material fact, because when anybody can do your job, then you are completely fungible.
And it's like anyone can do your job, but your job has got so many weird little elements that it's just become more and more grindingly dull. Like, you can sort of, anyone can do your job, but your job's got all these like forms you have to fill in and etc. That's why
absolutely.
I think this fits into the increasing irrelevance of this sort of NRS social grades way of understanding class. The way people talk about, what about C1, D1, who's this, and are we losing touch? Is the left losing touch with these people? But then you actually dig deep into it and you go, oh, right, some electrician who owns 2 houses, so they're living off a combination of rent and being an electrician. This person can be classed as working class, whereas someone working as an academic who's got like, I don't know, 1 seminar a week on like a 0 hours contract, that person's middle class. Yeah. Your kind of point that what is traditionally the bourgeoisie, or the petty bourgeoisie, at least of like lawyers and teachers and people like that, white collar workers, have been absorbed by this increasingly alienating replaceableness of work. I
mean, this is of course not to say that there aren't very real differences between the kind of work that people do. Absolutely. But I guess one way of putting it might be, what do we stand to gain if we recognise how much so many of us, and increasing numbers of us, have in common in terms of the way in which we are alienated by our work, regardless of the precise amount of money or lack thereof that we have at the end of the month.
Absolutely. You talk in the book about the problem of nostalgia, the nostalgia of both the right and the left. There is a desire on the left to return to, in America, the New Deal era, or here, the kind of spirit of 45. And there's obviously loads of problems with that in terms of race and gender, certainly. But obviously what they're getting at is like, wouldn't it be good if unions were more powerful or we had full employment? But obviously that's really limited. So what are the problems with this nostalgia?
I think you're quite right that a lot of our political discourse, even at the level of metaphor, gets pulled into imagining that the solutions to our current predicaments are contained in some sort of return. The hopefully novel thing we try to show in our section on this in the book is that it's not simply that New Deal and then post-war moments did a lot of good things, but unfortunately they were sexist and racist at the time, and so it's not merely that this is a sort of unfortunate coincidence. Actually, those negative sides of it were produced by the very definition of work that the period embraced. This isn't a kind of absolute futurist statement that to look back at all on paradigms and thinkers of earlier periods is an impermissible nostalgia. Actually, hopefully it's a question of rereading those moments.
And in some ways, perhaps there's a warning in that post-war New Deal moment, which is that in whatever way work gets defined, it's likely to leave some forms of work outside its delineations, which gets exploited in order to prop up that idea, in this case, of the family wage. Work is a really big, expansive thing that, goes into the most tiniest crevices of everyday life. And whichever way you define it, there's a danger there that you exploit somebody or something. So that going forward, this is something we have to bear in mind, I guess.
So in criticising nostalgia, you're not saying that, like, everything that's ever happened in the past is bad and therefore we should never refer to it.
Yeah.
Maybe be careful.
Not in this instance.
There's a 2-week grace period. Anything before that is reactionary, I'm sorry to say.
So, how does work and how we think about work affect our ideas of community and how communities are organised?
Well, certainly in terms of Jean-Luc Nancy's idea of work and désœuvrement that we've discussed, there is a real danger. The definition of work is used to prop up what, according to him, are ultimately fascist ideas of community always. He goes right in the deep end there. You need to leave your definitions of work open in order to also have an open idea of community. I mean, this sounds a little bit abstract, but it's intuitive enough. Whenever people talk about protecting workplaces, it's very quickly about scapegoating communities or even individuals who are somehow threatening those workplaces. And somehow the idea of work always gets linked to a particular idea of community.
The ideas that Mareile is describing here of this tradition that we sketch of 20th century French philosophy and this concept of désœuvrement, what it basically means is that it's harder than you think to get rid of work as a kind of fundamental lens that all of Western culture ends up being determined by. Community is a really kind of great example of that. That so often by community we mean your work function within a community. The way New Labour talked about unemployment is kind of a clear example of that in action. Community is one of those words that everybody thinks that they agree with, but then as soon as you start trying to pin it down, you very quickly kind of tend to drift right in your definition of it. The argument was made at that point that the problem of unemployment, or to use their preferred technocratic euphemism, social exclusion, the problem of social exclusion was that you were not properly a member of the community. What was the answer to that? Make benefits much more conditional. It was to turn unemployment into a job in itself. The idea was that these people, their problem is not that the neoliberal revolution of the previous decade and a half had taken away available work. The problem was that these people they're not part of the community enough.
Yeah.
The solutions that were floated in order to resolve that problem, they were intended to bring people back into the community of work, but actually had the effect of treating them as less than citizens already, the kind of beginning of a very illiberal drift in the treatment of the unemployed under New Labour, which has reached such, frankly, catastrophic levels in our present moment. When you say that the problem is you're not enough of a citizen because you're not doing the kind of work that we recognise, very quickly that excuses treating them as less than citizens.
That's it. I guess in another way you could say, what is the difference between a worker and a citizen? For example, when retired people are talked about, it's always in terms of the contribution they've already made. So this very profoundly economic idea of citizenship elevates work as the centre of everything in life. And this is particularly problematic, of course, when we're talking about refugees.
Yeah.
Less of an issue in Britain because you haven't left any in whatsoever. But on the continent, often the case for accepting refugees is made on the potential economic contribution that they'll very quickly be able to make. So the sense that there isn't any room for humans on any other level than as a worker or a potential worker.
And it again puts it back onto the individual, doesn't it? Of like the individual as job seeker. All the stuff of how benefits work and the idea of the job seeker comes from Major and then New Labour. But the economic model of necessarily having 3 to 5% of the population unemployed to keep inflation down. Capitalism requires 3 to 5% of people to just be unemployed.
Even as it redefines employment in order to pretend that it has full employment.
Yeah. So it's right, that happens and you go, well, actually we need permanent unemployment. And at the same time, not exactly the same time, because you point out in the book that under Thatcher, the dole wasn't massively reformed. The welfare system remained basically the post-war welfare system until Major and then really Blair radically altered it. But they come about, the putting it back on the individual, that kind of get on your bike thing, comes right when the system is geared towards making more people unemployed. But then we get stuff now, don't we? Like the modern conservatives boasting about more people being in work than ever before. If you interrogate that, there's more people in work, but most people in poverty are in work.
This is why this idea of malemployment was so important to us. So this idea that unemployment and forms of underemployment and precarious employment merge into one.
The crisis has got to a stage that actually warrants a whole new vocabulary. That you can, at the moment, we've got a situation where you can count as employed, but not be making enough money to live on. You can count as employed and be working in an entirely kind of humiliating kind of role with no dignity whatsoever. You can be employed and still be on benefits, as indeed most of the people accounting for the welfare bill are. You can be employed and be homeless. So in other words, if you had a kind of checklist of conventional expectations that you'd have of work, if you had a checklist of the myths actually that they tell you in the job centre are the rewards of the good citizen who works, actually you just wouldn't be ticking off the kind of conventional historical guarantees of what it means to be in work. We've got cases of people working side by side in supermarkets who one of them is 0 hours employee, the other is a workfare recipient, one is unemployed, the other is employed. The two of them perform the same work right next to each other. They go to the same food bank, they go to the same job centre and go home at night to the same sheltered accommodation wearing the same uniform. So what we wanted to show is that actually our conventional moralised opposition between employment and unemployment, where one is secure and the other is insecure, one is healthy and the other is unhealthy, one counts as a proper citizen and the other doesn't, that this has actually been broken down in the current regime, both employment and unemployment are so bad that they seem to be the same thing, that also kind of opens the space of disemployment. People who have been thrown out of either work or the benefit system altogether by the increasing use of sanctions since 2010, thrown out entirely so that they don't appear in the conventional economy at all. There have always been benefit sanctions for as long as there's been a welfare state. What's different from the coalition onwards is that it's not only the case that you can be sanctioned because you haven't done work that you've been asked to do, and it's not only the case that you can be sanctioned because you're secretly doing cash-in-hand labour elsewhere. The postmodern twist on it is that you can get sanctioned for failing to fulfil the bureaucratic process.
The job
itself.
of not having a job.
Yeah, exactly. This work for labour, this fake work that is created in order to make unemployment a job. So if the welfare state, the welfare system is there on the basis that a liberal society has a responsibility to keep a bare minimum of a lifeline for everybody, when you start using that bare minimum of a lifeline as a with the withdrawal of that as a punishment for not completing the right form, clearly you've departed from a pretty fundamental principle. So that's why we say there is also such a thing as disemployment, a new form of expulsion from the economy and society as such.
Let's think about what you say in the book about leisure. In what ways has our free time become increasingly similar to what we would normally understand as work?
I guess one simple example that's been discussed in various books on the topic for some years is the way in which the browsing that we do online obviously does procure profits for various companies. And there's an artwork about this called Wages for Facebook, suggesting that, well, just as in the 70s, an international women's movement demanded wages for housework because, as Silvia Federici outlines in her manifesto, because of the way capitalism obviously depended on all this unpaid work that was done in the household. Maybe we could demand wages for Facebook because we spend all this time on there. Apparently it's free time, but really money's being made. That's interesting in itself. While this is sinister and controls our data, etc., and brings up all sorts of problems, in some ways we may not care so much whether, whilst we're having fun online, some other party's making money of that. But then there is another level, and that's the extent to which the things that we are ostensibly doing for fun online are becoming a certain kind of work-like activity. The YouTubers are one of the examples that we look at there. There's a certain kind of essential myth of what that apparently beautiful thing is, which is having fun online and somehow, as by accident, also making money at the same time, which the myth of the YouTuber is. And we were reminded of a fairy tale about what is described as a young and beautiful and good girl called Gold Marie, who wanders on her own through this sort of strange, uncanny landscape where these household tasks just speak to her as out of nowhere. So there are these apples on the tree demanding to be picked, and she, as instinctively, picks the apples and just does it. Nobody tells her to do it, she just performs the task. Then there are these loaves of bread outside an oven, calling out to be baked. And again, without question, she just gets on with the job and gets the bread baked. Ultimately, she is rewarded. Golden coins just drop out of the sky and attach to her dress. And then the golden virgin returns home in triumph. On the one hand, we get spontaneous remuneration, money dropping out of the sky from the heavens, quite literally, as a sort of a new form of wage, a wage that isn't a wage, but that is a reward. And in some ways, how that is what's so attractive about the YouTube fantasy, because it's not actually you being paid for a job that you do. No, it's you being rewarded for your intrinsic goodness and beauty and likability. So this is obviously an attractive idea, but it's also one that, and it's, of course, we know that it's wrong. We know that most YouTubers can't possibly live by the money, the advertising revenue that they may or may not get through the channel. We know that a very few people do, and the ones who do have to work incredibly hard at pretending to to just be spontaneously likable, when in reality it becomes this really elaborate performance. But it's not so much them in themselves that we're interested in, but them as a sort of paradigmatic figure of our time. Isn't there a way in which we all have to act like we are internet celebrities, in the sense that we all have to sell our likability in the first instance, have to somehow seem charismatic, have to all be politicians, all be celebrities, regardless of what the role is? I mean, this might take some really kind of simple forms, like you may only apply for a customer service role, but you might point to your followers online to show what a good communicator you are. But it might be also something deeper than that, where it's just literally this sense that what you do when you go to work is just sell your likability as a person. You sell yourself, body and soul, whether you're a sex worker or a banker. And then, of course, also the flip side of it. What happens if money seems to fall from the sky? What happens if everybody's a freelancer and there isn't a boss?
We've got a few little parables or fictions spread through the book. We're both from English literature backgrounds, so that's one way in which the little stories creep into the book. But
they're good.
A pairing we wanted to suggest was between Gold Marie, who somebody doing their makeup tutorials or chatting about their day on their vlog, or somebody just gaming and streaming it on Twitch, that some of these people are virtuous enough that just doing what comes naturally will result in gold falling from the sky. We could see a sort of partner to that fairy tale in these two very trashy horror movies, Creep and Creep 2.
I love this bit of the book, by the way.
Okay.
This is good. The bits these two are talking about right now, the young girlification and what James is about to talk about with Creep, that's worth the price of admission. It's very good.
Right. Well, no spoilers.
Go on.
Creep, this hipster, early 40s filmmaker is kind of down on his luck, and he answers an ad from some guy who wants a filmmaker to come out into the forest and make a film for him. And it seems like a weird job, but the guy goes out and does it because, when you're precariously self-employed, you have to reach out for those loaves, as Gold Marie did. And those moments where in a kind of more conventional job, you might think, actually, this is a bit much. This is going too far. I'm not going to do it. In the horror movie, precarious labour world of Creep, of course, you keep doing it. And the guy acts increasingly the employer acts increasingly strangely, but because you haven't been paid yet, you stay in the situation. So what was striking to us is the way that every horror movie, everyone says, "Oh, you just leave, wouldn't you? What's he doing? Don't go upstairs." That actually has a material, economic answer, because you've got to stay in order to get paid. Interestingly, in Creep 2,
they're a YouTuber, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a YouTuber. Yeah, so we get this kind of connection drawn between a precarious labourer and a YouTuber. The film recognises somehow, the franchise recognises this connection. And to that we would have to add another story, the real life case from 2011 of
Richard Beasley.
This is the guy who, he himself was a sort of disemployed figure in our sense of the term. He was, it's more filmic than Creep, actually. Yeah. He was a down-on-his-luck preacher who had been involved in pimping. He, like the characters answering the online ads in Creep, Beasley acts like a perfect online entrepreneur. He starts advertising on Facebook for somebody to come and work on this farm. It doesn't exist. And when the people come to work on the farm, he kills them and steals their car and portable property. Beasley, in spotting that there were these forgotten men, these middle-aged guys, either divorced or single, who didn't have family connections, didn't have professional connections, and so were really available to being offered this fantasy online that they could come and live this post-work existence, actually, occupying this farm. They're tempted into it, and on they go. We point out that this is exactly Trump's, the people that Trump was appealing to, and what won him those Rust Belt states is essentially a surprise. So, these examples and stories come together to show this thread running through all these different kinds of labour that all have in common, well, like Goldmarie, you're under the illusion that it's no longer your actual tasks that are the thing you're being rewarded for. It's some kind of inherent virtue there in your very identity, even your very biology. That's regime of desirability, I can put it that way in which it's your inherent desirableness that is what you're being rewarded for, but that desirableness is actually what makes you so vulnerable right now.
And maybe something to draw together there. So in the Goldmarie folktale, the attractive thing is that precisely reward doesn't come, no human actor has forced her to do the tasks, and no human actor as such rewards her. The reward just seems to come from nowhere. And I guess the sinister side of that myth of YouTube celebrity, let's say, is when the money comes from nowhere, then there's also no employer. There's nobody to hear your complaint. There's nobody to complain to. And that comes out most creepily in both that murder case and the horror film, in the sense that, of course, yes, these people are not in a position to say no to the job because they're all freelancers, because you follow the ad, you go to this nowhere place and nowhere person. And then, of course, they're stuck. And then, of course, they get murdered and disappear in the horror film version. But in the employment tribunal version of this, there's no boss to whom to complain. And in that sort of gig economy, or whatever you want to call it, sort of, as it increases its reach, it also makes you more on your own as a worker, because those traditional structures just disappear more and more.
Well, like you say, that we talk exaggeratedly in these stories about like killing and death. But with self-employment, that kind of precarious self-employment becoming the norm, what you're doing, there isn't a boss, an external boss, but there is an internal boss. You become the one going, oh, I'm going to have to, even though I feel a bit sick today, I'm going to have to put out content, specifically with YouTube. But a lot of jobs, like you say, we're not specifically talking about YouTube. We're talking about YouTube as a clear example of the most exaggerated form of it. And we can tell it's so important to culture because YouTuber, it's overtaken astronaut as the thing kids most want to do. But then if you actually, you look at the conditions of YouTubers, there's a huge mental health crisis, even at people who are the ones who are making tens of thousands of pounds, there's mental health stuff. But if we go to that idea of death, like as soon as you're putting a boss inside yourself, I mean, one, that makes it pretty difficult to unionize, because how are you going to unionize against someone that's in your own head? But also if they're controlling your behavior, if you would want to do one thing, but you're unable to do so because you're your own boss, and therefore kind of disciplining yourself, are you alive?
Well, this is precisely why we reject in the book the story of Bartleby, the famous story written by Herman Melville in the 19th century, which has been a kind of totem text for the anti-work movement, and indeed was read aloud at Zuccotti Park by the Occupy movement. The claim can be made that actually part of the structural failure of Occupy can be read in the fact that they think that story can still cut it. The story where the scrivener, the copy clerk, suddenly one day at work says, when told his task, he says, I would prefer not to, and keeps saying it, and everybody in the workplace becomes obsessed with him. He does die, not without occupying the minds of everyone around him, becoming this kind of great work of literature. But to still be resorting to this idea that there's something radical about saying I would prefer not to, there's a sort of mistake there, because it implies an audience for your protest.
That's right. So, and interestingly, you could see that it seems that in that what you might actually call a kind of 19th century tradition of workers' horror that already begins with Dickens and with Sherlock Holmes, where there are all these minor characters who somehow have not got the opportunity to prefer not to, but they just have to take these weird jobs, whether it's fixing some weird machine in a Sherlock Holmes story, or becoming a governess in this really weird household where they require you to cut off your hair and then it turns out a double, or whatever. All of these weird stories which usually end badly for the person who had to take on the job, regardless of whether they preferred not to or not. They kind of should sort of show that from industrialization onwards, there are these increasing spaces where, I mean, exploitation, of course, is longer, has a longer history than industrialization, but how how there are those pockets increasingly under liberal capitalism where there's no boss, there is no audience, there is nobody to whom you can complain. And this, of course, in digital capitalism is crystallized and exaggerated.
It's interesting you say that about, just going back, about kids not wanting to be an astronaut, but wanting to be a YouTuber. The fact that presentation and communication has replaced activity, even at the level of
imagination.
A former student of mine who became a secondary school teacher, she came back for a kind of a teacher's day where we were like sharing, approaches to teaching, and a lot of the teachers were saying that trying to teach English literature at school, I mean, part of it has very specific political reasons. The syllabus is a big problem, but actually a big part of the problem is like getting the students to read a whole novel. This was a problem when we were kids, of course. But it's the fact that like the dominant mode of reading and communication and understanding of text is so like different to the experience of reading a whole novel. And I sort of tried the idea that the big Silicon Valley companies want you to be distracted. They want you to be constantly jumping from one thing to another, to have 50 tabs up. And actually there might be something almost rebellious about pulling on the brakes, as Walter Benjamin would put it, and saying, no, I'm logging the hell off and I'm going to read this book. And she said, but they don't want to rebel. They just completely identify with this. And, I'm not saying that kids are inherently reactionary or anything like that. But it's just interesting that they don't acknowledge the platform as an antagonist or a form of power in that way. Rather, that is what communication is meant to be. And it's there that they aspire to succeed.
And maybe just to add another element of this sort of YouTuber celebrity approach to life, which is the way in which its structure permits very smoothly to disappear all sorts of social safety net functions in a very strange way. So, for example, the phenomenon of sites like Just Giving, which are bigger in America than they're here, but are getting increasingly big here as well, where people are very much selling their own predicament, whether it is a cancer diagnosis or some other life crisis, and turn it into an attractive narrative in order to get strangers to fund them. Yes, charity has always been inherently reactionary. Charity is not what we want, but it's another level when it isn't, okay, we're just going to have this charitable institution and somehow collect money and give it to the needy. No, the needy have to present themselves as the deserving poor, not just deserving, but also attractive, interesting. They have to hold your attention precisely according to the rules of the attention economy, enough for you to give them some money for them to be able to pay for their cancer treatment. So you can see how this isn't just something that, changes the idea of what it is desirable to be. It just makes it very easy to just hide the fact that all of those supportive welfare structures are disappearing and instead are being replaced with this most reactionary idea that anything that you get has to be due to your own internet desirability.
Crowdfunding commodifies whatever you're trying to get the funding for, doesn't it? Even if that doesn't matter if it's a video game or cancer care. You had a great line in the book which kind of relates to all this, I just want to pull out, which was, by farming our desires, capitalism not only gets free housework and free data, it also produces subjects who relate to themselves as commodities online and offline.
Thank you.
That's one of yours.
Very good. But I think that kind of ties together everything we were discussing there.
Very neat.
To wrap up, we should return back to what you said the kind of book was originally maybe a reaction to, which is the idea of post-work or anti-work, and maybe what you call the Jetsons fallacy.
Right. I mean, this one's is actually quite a tricky philosophical problem in a way, but it can be put in a very simple way.
Explain for the common reader with cartoons.
I was kind of trying to leave that out, but all right. So, if you're not familiar with the Jetsons, as I wasn't until James brought up this idea. It's like the Flintstones. It's basically the mirror program to the Flintstones. So it's set in the future, and there's this nuclear family, of course, middle-class nuclear family. And the joke and the pleasure of the show in many ways is that even though it is the far distant high-tech future, they live exactly like a 1960s family, including some of the, gadgets, etc. And that's basically how it works. So what's the Jetson fallacy? Well, it is the assumption that in the future we will want and value the same things as we do right now. But how can we know that? And in terms of the kind of post-work project, the tricky question is, well, if capitalism harnesses and molds our desires to a certain extent, we can't really have a new world without at least some new desires, or perhaps some really old ones. But how can we want that new world if we don't get to have the desires fulfilled that we feel right now? So how do you get from that old world to the new world without? So that's sort of the problem.
Yeah, our initial critique of like a lot of the people who have argued for a post-work future where robots or whatever do all the work and we therefore live these lives of leisure, that begins in the 19th century through to a great liberal thinker, Maynard Keynes, through to the left and through to the present day. Our first kind of retort to it was, so often the radical idea of a life without work has ended up being justified on the basis of other purer kinds of work. This is kind of an interesting sort of philosophical slip, if you like, that how do I justify to someone? And it's very interesting. You get into a pub conversation about the idea of fully automated luxury communism, and people just beg their way back into work. It's always, oh yeah, but I know this guy. He couldn't be happy if he wasn't in his job. This would be terrible. There's something actually slightly traumatic about being told you can do whatever you want. And so it's almost as if that psychological problem perhaps has led anti-work thinkers from William Morris and Oscar Wilde onwards to almost apologetically kind of tell us the kinds of good productive activities that we'll be able to do after work has ended. And even Marx, when he does occasionally allow himself to discuss what it is we'll be doing, they tend to be sort of the more anecdotal light passages, but nonetheless they're revealing. It's all about, okay, in the morning you'll go fishing, in the evening we'll discuss Hegel. A lot of Marxist commentators have stressed how Marx was a great scholar of Aeschylus. He tried to write a novel based on Sterne's Tristram Shandy. All this kind of, finally we'll be able to do all this appreciation of art. Finally you'll pick up that clarinet from school and you'll be able to kind of reach this fulfillment. It's a variation on the Jetson's fallacy because it assumes that having totally transformed the economic system, you'll nonetheless be participating in the kinds of responsible activity that at the moment we imagine we're only being prevented from doing by our working lives. Tellingly, it's not the case that Marx says it's going to be great under communism, you'll do your couple of hours work, then you can just ride around on your penny farthing doing wheelies, drink loads of gin. It's not that you can't just say, oh yeah, you're just going to have a laugh. You have to, in the post-work tradition, kind of make a covertly moralized, demand for this other kind of so-called good work. I mean, a good material example of this, even outside leftist debates, is the explosion of vegan meats right now. Subway, meatless meatballs, Greggs famously.
KFC.
Historically, like, what would be the leftist response to something like factory farming or the environmental damage done by consumption of meat? The reason there is this new consumer audience for veganism is people are starting to get the message that we can't sustain the world on this level of meat eating. A kind of traditional left interrogation would want to say, well, where does this desire for meat come from in the first place? Does it connect to ideas of nationalism? Does it attach to kind of questions of the cultivation of masculinity and so on? The fully automated luxury communism answer is don't worry too much about it. just as when we say, is our problem on the left that we can't answer people's aspirations to own commodity goods? The fully automated luxury communism answer is, well, they can have those luxury goods then.
Right. We're going to find a way to produce some that gets rid of the violences attached to them. Don't worry about the cultural associations. It's a real shift towards the material. Which, if we can make you a burger that is grown from plants that tastes and looks like a real burger, and that is, you want the real burger, we give you the fake burger that hasn't hurt anyone, no problem. So that's of course the Falk sort of position. But then the question is, well, are there maybe some problems nonetheless? What about those cultural associations of meat eating? What about the sexual politics of meat? We're not saying that it's right or wrong. We're just interested in this new response.
I mean, in that way, the Falk answer to the Jetsons fallacy, the idea that, we'll embrace the Jetsons, even if it were everything in the future were exactly the same in terms of our selfishness, our greed, our unkindness, our sexism, racism, whatever, even if that were all there in the future, nonetheless, that doesn't change the nature of the economic demand, as it were. Increasingly, in all areas of cultural criticism, we're starting to see figures who make a very similar claim that desire itself has maybe not been appreciated in its full complexity in a lot of left-wing critique. And one of the things that we need to be able to do on the left is to understand that people's desires are very often complex and contradictory, and that the offer we're making them needs to be one that avoids a kind of too straightforward moralism.
I think that just about sums it up. I guess this idea with repurposing your desire in some way still acknowledges that there may well be things about our current desires that are bad and that need readdressing. In a way, the vegan burger is an example which seems to work well enough, but what if we get to sex dolls for all or whatever? I mean, it's never going to be as simple as simply giving everybody what they want, but that hopeful optimism of repurpose your desire would be a mixture of analysis with this idea that we are damaged by capitalism, we are products of it in some ways, but we can take ourselves and our bad desires as we are right now and turn it into something else, but not to assume that what we have to do is to abandon our machine and run in the woods. As we know, they are only full of creepy murderers off Craigslist anyway. So we don't want to do that.
Mandatory Redistribution Party was created and produced by Sean Morley and Jack Evans. Our title theme was created by Ella Jean. Mareile and James's book, Work, Want, Work, Labour and Desire at the End of Capitalism, is out soon from Zed Books. Do keep an eye out for it. If you enjoy Mandatory Redistribution Party, please further realise your desires, and those of mine and Sean's, by leaving us a review, following us on Twitter at Mando Party, and please do sub-a-dub-dub. Oh no, I'm sorry. Subscribe. Just subscribe. How do I turn this off? Control Z, delete, escape. What do I? Help.